Welcome to Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Join Dr. David Ramadan and Schar School experts as they engage in thought-provoking conversations with elected officials, policymakers, and thought leaders. Listen for in-depth discussions on policies, politics, governance, and career pathways, all designed to elevate your perspectives and expand your mind.
Welcome to another episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Today's conversation dives into the shadowy world of political power in Washington, the lobbyists, fixers, and insiders who shape U.S. policy from the sidelines. And who better to walk us through the ecosystem than our guest, Brody Mullins. Brody is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter with the Wall Street Journal and the author of the new book, The Wolves of K Street. Over 2 decades, he's chronicled corruption, backroom deals, and how money moves in American politics, often pushing reform through sheer investigative grit. Joining me as co-host is Dr. David Rehr, director of the Center of Business Civic Ethics here at the Schar School. He's a former high-profile lobbyist himself and one of the foremost thinkers on lobbying ethics and transparency. Together, we'll break down the evolution of influence in D.C., examine where reform fits in today's billion-dollar lobbying industry, and ask, can policy survive the politics of power? Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks.
Brody, how did you get your start in covering lobbying and corruption?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. So, one of those strange people who was born and raised in D.C. and has stayed around, never really left the 1 mile radius of where I was born. I grew up sort of like, listening to the nightly news and reading the Washington Post, probably trying to get to the sports section, but, catching some of the front page news along the way. For some reason, at a very young age in elementary school, I decided I wanted to be a writer. And in high school, I took a journalism course and wanted to be a reporter because D.C. is a small town and certainly was a small town when I grew up. You sort of knew people who worked in the media. And my mom worked with a woman who was the sister of John Harwood. John Harwood was a famous political presidential reporter for the Wall Street Journal when I was growing up. And I got connected with him when I was in high school. And he set me up for what we called an internship in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, which really wasn't an internship. It was sort of like just a volunteer job where I got things from the fax machine and handed faxes out to the reporters, and I got people's mail for them. And I did the clips. No one knows what clips are anymore, but the newspapers would come and you literally clip them, put them on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and file them. It was sort of like the first internet, or just a file cabinet where I'd file all the stories for reporters. I just sort of fell in love with journalism, with the Wall Street Journal. I was dealing with all these like giants of political journalism and reading their stories and handing their stories out to them. And also that was the summer 1992 when Bill Clinton was running for president. And I think whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that was really just a fascinating campaign because it was the first campaign since 1980, after having Reagan and Bush for such a long time. And Clinton was young and he was fun and dynamic and interesting. So all these sort of forces connected at once. And I sort of fell in love with political journalism. And at that point, literally when I was in high school, I wanted to be a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. So that was sort of my North Star to get there.
Fantastic. And I remember that campaign. I was on the Bush Quayle side at the time, and it was really, really interesting. And a full loop, I met President Clinton a couple of weeks ago at Governor McAuliffe's house, and it was a fascinating meeting. So that was the start in journalism. At what point did you realize what the power of lobbyists is, or how powerful they really are, and how does that affect the system?
Yeah, I don't think there was an exact moment, but when I was in high school and college, I really wanted to be a reporter covering presidential politics. I read all the books, The Making of the President, 1960, and all the books about great presidential campaigns. And I thought that would be a great career. And then for some reason along the way, I'm not really sure how, maybe it was, one of my first jobs was with a place called Congress Daily, where I was covering mainly the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee. And in those committees, you learn that, politics and policy are really the key, and that, covering presidential campaigns and even covering the White House, sounds glamorous. And at Thanksgiving, you could tell a bunch of great stories at the table. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a boring job. You're just sitting around waiting for the president or a spokesperson to say something, and then you just write up a story and you're done. Whereas if you're covering policy in committees or subcommittees, they're really much more fascinating and challenging stories. There's multiple sides to the story. There's lobbyists, there's money. It's not Republicans against Democrats. It's a mix of urban against rural, or, what district someone represents plays out in what policy they support. So I found it to be much more of a chess game than checkers. And, frankly, just found that more challenging and exciting. So I sort of started covering the lobbying world. And then I don't think there was a light switch moment, but sort of over my career, I sort of understood that the power that lobbyists have and that corporations have, and, and labor unions at times, they have much more influence over the laws, the legislation, and policy that are being made, sometimes than even the lawmakers. And in our book, we sort of pick a couple moments like that to go back to Bill Clinton for a moment. When Bill Clinton won in 1992, as you remember, it was, Ross Perot was in that race. So Clinton won with only 43%.
Yep.
And so when he comes in the presidency, he's at the height of his power. He decides he's going to be a big liberal. And he says that national healthcare reform is going to be his number one priority. National healthcare is something that Democrats for a century had tried and failed to enact, including, back to FDR. But Bill Clinton has the presidency. He's in his honeymoon period. Democrats control the House. Democrats control the Senate. There was a poll that said that something like 70% of Americans were unhappy with the healthcare system. And the year before, Bob Dole and I think 32 or 23 Senate Republicans had a healthcare bill. So there was even support on the other side. So this looked like something that could happen. And then the healthcare industry got involved, and they started lobbying against the plan using an incredible grassroots campaign. They had the famous Harry and Louise television ads, which were really the first issue ads out there. And they ran this huge campaign. They spent over $100 million against the Clinton healthcare bill. And what's amazing is, in this day and age, we throw around billions, but to put that in comparison, $100 million was just about as much money as Bill Clinton spent to get elected president. Mm-hmm. Healthcare industry spent that against him. The upshot here is that, as we all know, the healthcare bill died a fabulous death. There was never a vote on the House floor, never a vote on the Senate floor. And what's amazing about that is that, one, it shows that not just all corporate lobby, but one lobby, just the health insurance industry, was able to defeat the wishes of the president of the United States, who controlled the House and the Senate. So that showed sort of how much influence, an industry lobby can have. And also that's, as an addendum to that story, that was sort of also a huge pivot point in our nation's history, or the history of Washington policy. At that point, Bill Clinton said, I'm not a liberal Democrat anymore. I'm a centrist. And he moved for, NAFTA and welfare reform and balancing the budget and deregulating banks. So it was a real moment in the Democratic Party where they went from sort of the FDR party and moved more to the center, which is kind of, where they have been since then, until very recently, on trade bills and sort of a generally pro-business belief in the party, which now all of a sudden is coming under attack. But anyway, I thought that was sort of a good moment when I sort of saw the power of the corporate lobby.
And that position that Bill Clinton took at the time is still a winning formula for Democrats today who take it. We just went through an election in Virginia, and that center-left, not going to touch the right to work position that now Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger took, put her 15 points on top in Virginia.
I agree with you. Do other Democrats? That's
not the New York and the Mamdani, segment
exactly.
of the party. And that's going to be their challenge in at some point, which direction they're going to go.
And that side is saying all those things that Bill Clinton did was wrong. Abandoning the workers on trade is like a real huge pivot point in the Democratic Party's history, and right back to that same fight. Which way are they going to go?
Yeah, it's incredible. And we're talking now this is 30 years later?
30 years later, same fight.
30 years later, same fight. Incredible.
They're all the same fights.
They are.
Just
They
keep
are.
going and going and going. It's like the rabbit. Yeah.
David Rehr, before I turn the mic to you, I was going to start the episode with this, but and do the disclosure that I am a lobbyist as well, but in the state of Virginia, I don't lobby federally. David Rehr, you lobbied federally. And I was going to say, give me a good anecdote to start the episode with, but then I changed my mind and said, let's just start with our guest. So my co-host, Dr. David Rehr, the microphone is yours.
So first off, I'm pro-lobby because I spent my entire year lobbying. And I was going to ask Brody, so the First Amendment allows Americans to redress their government on grievances. And I know we have 350 million people, and I tell my class, everybody has different ideas and opinions. How do we look at lobbying and corporations and labor unions, and I would argue nonprofits and all sorts of different economic self-interests in America, but not diminish their ability to talk to their elected officials, at the same time not bully the system into pushing policies that are bad for a lot of Americans? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of the issue of where we might be right now in history. Just to go back to where you started, the First Amendment says that everyone has the right to free speech, reporters, individuals, billionaires, people who run companies, lobbyists, and Americans have the right to petition their government for changes in whatever policy that they oppose or support. Even before then, the founding fathers foresaw a day where there would be lobbying. They called them factions. We call them interest groups. They call them factions. They thought there'd be a pro-worker faction and there'd be sort of a pro-industry faction or business faction. And they thought that these two forces would fight each other over every piece of legislation. And they thought they would be of equal size and importance and weight. And they would sort of fight to a draw and we'd have compromised legislation. And that system largely worked for most of our 200 years or almost 250 years. What's changed is that in most of the last century, companies actually had very little influence in Washington and didn't spend a lot of money lobbying Washington, and labor unions and the American public did. And therefore, from the New Deal to the Great Society, we had all this growth of the federal government, all new protections for workers and minimum wage and the 5-day work week and labor unions and all sorts of pro-consumer policies that came up to the 1970s. And the 1970s, all of a sudden companies said, when we went to an economic decline under President Carter, companies said, hey, wait a second, these interest groups on the other side have too much power and influence, and they're making all these rules and regulations that's restraining the free marketplace. So at that point in the 1970s, companies said, we're going to start spending money in DC and moving offices to DC and funding think tanks and paying for lobbyists and making PAC contributions. And the shift that happened there is that from the 1970s to very recently, companies have only gained in influence, and they have way more influence than labor unions because at the same time, labor union world has shrunk. So the imbalance for most of the last 30, 40 years is that companies have had so much influence at the expense of regular Americans because labor unions just haven't had much influence, and environmental groups haven't had much influence, and consumer groups haven't had much influence. So in terms of how to fix things, I'm not sure. I think one key thing that is broken is our disclosure system. Basically, we have two laws for lobbying. One is you can't bribe people, and two is you have to disclose what you're doing. And just to put some numbers to it, the last time we had a lobbying reform was 2007 after the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal that you remember because you and I used to talk a lot back then. And that was a scandal that involved a corrupt Republican lobbyist who was bribing members of Congress. And the response to that was the Democratic Party took power in the House and Nancy Pelosi passed a reform bill that basically said that anyone who's a lobbyist or works for a company can't buy anything of value for a member of Congress. And so what happened was that law basically applied to lobbyists, and it made the word lobbyist into a sort of gave it a bad name. And therefore, many lobbyists said, oh, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm a consultant, or I'm an advisor, or I'm a strategist. And so in 2007, if you look at the lobbying disclosure database, there were 15,000 registered lobbyists in Washington. Today, there's 13,000. The number of lobbyists has only gone down. And that would indicate that the lobbying business is shrinking. And obviously, the lobbying business is exploding. It's just that the people are trying to influence policy without being actually called a lobbyist. So I think that shows that the disclosure system is broken and needs to be updated.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would add to that the tentacles of influence have now gone beyond personal relationships to PAC money, television, local constituents, basically trying to organize every sympathetic person to your cause to connect with their member of Congress. I mean, I remember at the beer wholesalers, I had one beer wholesaler who said, who's a member who's now retired, but said, our kids go to school together in the morning. Do you want me I'm like, talk to them on the way you're dropping your kids off, because this is really a valuable vote. And we
Right.
did, and we won, and it was terrific. But we looked for in fact, I'm teaching my students tonight, you have to look for every tool and then utilize that tool on behalf of your membership or company or your labor union or your citizen group.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So under the law, a lobbyist, the legal definition of a lobbyist is someone who spends 20% or more of their time actively talking to a member of Congress or to a government official on behalf of a client for a piece of legislation. So even back in your day when you were at the beer wholesalers or at NAB, you probably didn't spend a full day every week talking to a member of Congress. That's a lot of time. And therefore, I don't know if you registered or not, but you probably would find not registering, even though your whole job is to influence legislation, because so much of lobbying these days is not actually talking to the member of Congress. That's the last thing you do. It's getting the constituents and writing the press releases and getting the public opinion and doing the polling and running or the PAC contributors, all the things that you just talked about. All those things are not considered lobbying, and therefore lots of lobbyists aren't considered lobbyists.
Yeah. I registered, and I always was a little more open and excessive with what I was doing, because I figured working in two industries, particularly the beer alcohol industry, I never wanted to be called on and said, you said you only met with 10 people, but you met with 12. Like, rather we overstate what we're doing than understate it. So.
Right. But as a result of that, another way of looking at this is that, where there are 4, 5, 6 million people who live in the Washington, D.C. area. And, we don't make anything in D.C. We don't make widgets. We don't make cars. All we do is make legislation. That's our company town, and it's all about making legislation. And of those 4 or 5 million people, only 15,000 are saying that they're actually involved in this game. I mean, unless you're a school teacher or a bus driver or work at a restaurant, you're somehow involved in shaping legislation, but only 15,000 of us say that we are.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not sure we're really making legislation either. I mean,
That's true.
We're failing it now.
So we're all as lobbyists, we all tell each other how important we are. But
Yep.
I'm sure, I look at people and go, really? And they're like, oh, I helped do this. I'm like, really? You didn't really. You're just telling your clients that so they continue to bankroll you to a fabulous lifestyle. I was going to say, Brody, that when that gift ban or the gift law changed, I then went into the former Chicago White Sox CEO mode of giving everything away that will remind people. I don't know if I ever told you this story. Like, I would give coffee cups, I would give pencil sets, anything that I could put the beer wholesaler's logo on that would sit on their desk. Because I figured if they saw that, they'd think of me, and therefore I could think of them. I started out with mouse pads. It was like a little industry of me every year thinking about what could we put there beyond. Sometimes we would give staffers and members free beer for their birthdays, anniversaries, so they would always think about us.
Right.
You didn't customize any beer for them, did you?
No. Well, it was always customized because we represented multi-different beer companies. So it couldn't be all Budweiser, but maybe there was Budweiser, Coors, Miller, Sam Adams, etc. But it was a lot of fun, and they loved it. So
Let's
it
talk
built
a
a lot
little
of
bit about the new book. In The Wolves of K Street, you follow the rise of few lobbying firms, 3, I believe. Why those players?
So we were looking for, look, our book is about topics that most Americans will find pretty boring. No one, of course, is listening to this podcast, but we're talking about corporate power and PAC donations and lobbying disclosure. And we realized in order to tell the story of how companies gained influence and how they use new lobbying tactics and how lobbying has changed and PACs have grown, that we need to have really colorful people. We need to tell the story through great characters and narratives, and people had tragic rises and falls. So we opened the book with a guy named Evan Morris, who was a big-time lobbyist for Genentech who actually who ended up dying, he was found dead on a golf course outside of DC with a bullet hole in his head. And, the old rule in journalism is if you're writing a story about corporate power and lobbying, you should start with a dead body on a golf course. So we did that. In fact, the night before he died, he was actually at a fundraiser at his house with Terry McAuliffe. Speaking of the Clintons and Terry McAuliffe, he was really trying to get into the Clinton fundraising world. He was involved in a big kickback and lobbying corruption scandal. And so we sort of tell his story, and we tell the story of other lobbyists and lobbying firms over time who tell us how Washington has changed. So we start with the dead body on a golf course, but we also, the first lobbyist we write about is a guy named Tommy Boggs, who I think everyone remembers that name. He started the firm Patton Boggs. Tommy Boggs, we consider sort of the first lobbyist of the modern era. Now, there were lobbyists before him, but this is the one who we picked, who started Patton Boggs in the late 60s and 1970s when Washington was completely different. Most people think of lobbying as the smoke-filled room, which doesn't exist anymore. But back in Tommy Boggs' era, there was a smoke-filled room. In fact, the smoke was coming from his cigars, I think, in the smoke-filled room. He grew up in a household in Washington, D.C., where both his mom and his dad were members of Congress. His dad was Hale Boggs Jr., who was a House Majority Leader. In 1972, he was on a fundraising trip in Alaska, and his plane disappeared in a snowstorm. He was never to be found again. And after that, the citizens of New Orleans elected his mom, Lindy Boggs, to be a House member. She served for 12 years. So Tommy Boggs, the soon-to-be lobbyist, grew up in a household where both his parents are members of Congress at a time when Washington was a lot different from it is now. Back then, power in Washington was held by just a few people, the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, a couple committee chairs, basically a dozen or so, maybe a half dozen powerful figures who controlled all laws and legislation. And Tommy Boggs grew up at a time when he knew those people because they would come to his house because, the LBJ would come to his house and his parents would go out to dinner with JFK and Sam Rayburn, the longtime Speaker of the House from Texas, was actually Tommy Boggs' babysitter. When his parents went out to dinner, the Speaker of the House would come babysit for him. So when he became a lobbyist, he knew all the important people at a time when you only needed to know a handful of people. That was sort of the old school relationship, smoke-filled room, favor trading, lobbying business that existed back then. So we write about Tommy Boggs back then to show how things used to be. And then we go to a firm called Black, Manafort and Stone, which is Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and Charlie Black. And they started changing lobbying a little bit. Yes, they used their relationships to get to President Ronald Reagan and other Republicans in the 1980s, but also they realized the power of grassroots. They realized that if you're trying to get a trade bill passed, instead of bringing in the CEO of a company or trying to get a one-off deal, you bring in the workers who would benefit or bring in the labor unions, partner with the labor unions. So they started to kind of create the new grassroots way of lobbying. And then later in the book, we get to Tony Podesta, the powerful Democratic lobbyist who really learned, who kind of perfected how to use the media and how to use grassroots to get members of Congress. And along the way, we sort of teach people how lobbying has moved from the relationship, one-on-one, smoke-filled room lobbying to grassroots, where today members of Congress are much more willing to listen and to do what their constituents want, rather than what some fat cat lobbyist tells them to do with a $5,000 PAC check. And so, corporations and the business lobby knows that. So corporations spend an enormous amount of time trying to persuade regular Americans to support a trade bill or to oppose some tax cut or whatnot, because they know that if they can get the support of a member of Congress constituents, the member of Congress will follow.
As different as their stories are, what do they collectively reveal about how influence really works in DC today?
I think that collectively they show how companies have gained influence in Washington and then held on to it. So as the world has changed, the corporate lobby continually evolves its tactics to try to stay in power. So, historically, like I said, before the 1970s, companies had very little influence. And then around the 1970s, companies started to gain influence. And that's when you write about Tommy Boggs, like how he wielded power on behalf of companies to defeat, FTC regulations and approve various legislation for his companies. And then Black, Manafort and Stone sort of evolves and does more grassroots. And along the way, companies are continually gaining and increasing their power by using new tactics that we write about with these lobbyists. What's fascinating, though, is that most fascinating to me is that our book came out last year, And it's all about, how powerful companies are and how much influence they have. And we looked around and realized that all of a sudden companies have less influence than they've had at any time in my lifetime. That every single industry, every single company is now under attack or under threat in Washington. The rise of populists in the Republican Party, of Donald Trump, and of sort of this more Lena Khan, Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party. So the anti-Bill Clinton wing, both parties are now sort of turning their guns on companies, on industries, and on associations. So that's been a fascinating change, because for my entire lifetime, there was this, as David knows, there's this very strong pro-business bipartisan center in DC. And that is going away. There's very little center. And members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, feel that there's political votes to be gained by attacking companies. And so we seem to be back to a position where we were in the 1970s, where there's this big fight over whether we're going to have sort of a pro-business environment in DC or go back to more of a progressive era like it existed before the 1970s. And that fight is taking place in both political parties, as we speak. A lot of those answers will play out in the next presidential primary system. But overall, I see the landscape for companies becoming more and more perilous in DC, which is fascinating.
And we're probably going to see that in the 2026 midterm elections quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's lining up for that. Dr. Rehr, I'll turn the microphone back to you.
So, Brody, I know Tony Podesta. He was on consultant for us
Right.
when I was at the NAB. You've got the comment, I think, in your book about the red shoes.
Yeah.
He was known as a lobbyist. You knew it was Tony, and he's a very nice man. But he always wore red shoes, which separated him apart from the thousands of other lobbyists, which I always got a kick up. But
I think that was
remember
by
one
design.
night we were at a fundraiser and Nancy Pelosi was there, and he just put his arm around my back. And he said, "David, I'll be sure I introduce you to her, and she'll like you." And I always remembered that as like a point in history of, wow, I've really become a great lobbyist now, because I'm going to be, she was the Speaker of the House at the
Right.
time. So I got a chance to meet her.
Did she like you? Did
I
she like
don't
you?
really know. Of course, I would tell people yes,
Right.
but I'm not really sure.
So Tony and his ex-wife, Heather Podesta, who was also a lobbyist, would talk about, they wore these extravagant outfits, as you say, just to stand out.
Yeah.
DC's a pretty buttoned down town. Everyone's from the last place where people wear suits around, here in New York, I guess. And they would wear these, colorful outfits with all sorts of flair, only to draw attention. So people knew them and remembered them. And it was a pretty effective tactic, I think.
Right. And in fact, next class, which is going to be the last class of the course, I talked to the students about the importance of a lobbyist, or even your organization, to differentiate yourself from the thousands of other people out there, or you get forgotten.
Right.
I think that's business in general is successful if they can differentiate their products, but particularly true for lobbyists, whether you're a researcher, whether you're in media, whether you're a consultant, people have to remember you, because if they don't remember you, what you care about doesn't move forward.
Sure.
That's kind of not a trick, but that's kind of a fundamental that people should know. So what do you think? We talked a little bit about the future. What do you think about the future of reform? And there's some talk about stock trades. That's, people will know that's been in the news recently, and the speaker having a great portfolio picker for her because she's become really wealthy over her time in Congress. But what do you think the future is going to hold for lobbying reform?
Unfortunately, there's only reform in Washington when there's a scandal, and there sort of needs to be a scandal to have reform. I mean, I see a bigger problem not on the lobbying side, but the campaign finance side. So on the lobbying side, I agree there should be better disclosure. How you make those rules it gets complicated once you get in the weeds in terms of who is influencing and who's not. If my parents call up their member of Congress and say, hey, the sidewalk needs to be fixed, do they need to register as a lobbyist? I mean, that seems too extreme, but there's a way of figuring that out. So there should be more disclosure there. The bigger problem to me is on the campaign finance side. We have a completely terrible and un-American, undemocratic campaign finance system right now, where individuals and corporations through their PACs are limited in what they can give. They have full disclosure. Companies have boards and oversight and all sorts of rules and regulations on their giving. The political parties and candidates can only accept a certain amount from a corporate PACs or from individuals. But then because of Citizens United, you've got this super PAC system where billionaires, not us, only billionaires, essentially, are allowed to give unlimited amounts of money to super PACs that can then turn around and spend unlimited amounts of money supporting or opposing candidates. And so we've got this system that's heavily weighted toward a small group of the wealthiest people in the country, which is exactly the opposite of the system that you're supposed to have. You're supposed to be giving power to the people, not to the wealthy. And we've got a system now where the wealthiest Americans have all this influence. I think that system needs to be fixed. A lot of people say about, you probably hear this, a lot of people say that Citizens United, opened the floodgates for corporate America to send a gusher of cash into elections. And that's not true. Companies, publicly held large companies, don't want to get involved in the super PAC business. I mean, you could explain how this worked, when you were working for companies. Companies want to be with the winner. Yes, they probably generally support the Republican more than the Democrat on business issues, but they want to be with the winner. So corporate PACs will give 55 or 60% of their money to the party who's in power, whether that's Republicans or Democrats. And they'll give 40 or 45% to the party that's not in power because they're going to be back in power at some point. Plus, on Capitol Hill, you need Republicans and Democrats to get things done. So corporate PACs want to be with both sides. What they don't want to do is put all their eggs in one basket and lose. So as a result, companies don't give to presidential candidates. Corporate PACs don't play in the presidential space. What a super PAC is a way to really put your thumb on the scale in a big time way for one candidate or another for president, House, or Senate. Companies don't want to do that. And therefore, they don't do that. With the exception of the oil and gas industry, big companies don't give to super PACs, which means corporations and individuals are giving money through the regulated, disclosed, capped way to the political parties and candidates. And the super PACs are being funded by billionaires who, for the most part, don't run publicly traded companies. They run privately held companies, and they can do whatever they want. And it seems that we've created an unfair system. I looked at the last presidential campaign, and in the last presidential campaign, for the first time in history, the super PAC supporting Donald Trump raised and spent more money supporting Donald Trump than Donald Trump and the RNC. So for the first time, the super PACs had more influence over Donald Trump's campaign than Donald Trump, or at least spent more money. On the Democratic side with Kamala Harris, that wasn't the case, but it'll certainly be the case next time. So we've got this system now where the unregulated, sometimes undisclosed, uncapped super PACs have more influence over the candidates and the political parties. And that just seems like a terrible system to me.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And unfortunately, nobody wants to bite the hand that feeds them.
So that's the problem, is that the winners make the rules. And
Right.
Can't imagine that members of Congress like this system. I can't imagine they like the fact that someone who they don't know, have never met, has more influence over their own campaign than they do. But if they win, maybe they're not going to change the system.
Right. And the other thing is those individuals on both sides tend to be a lot more ideological.
Correct.
So while people are talking about pulling the country together, they see the country in a certain view and they're like, we can pull the country together as long as it's down my road.
Correct. And that's a lot of our book talks about the rise of corporate PACs and the influence that corporate PACs have over Republicans and Democrats in creating a pro-business agenda and defeating labor unions. And a lot of our book is talking about how that's bad. But by the end of the book, we sort of come around to Citizens United and say, you know what, those corporate PACs and that system pulled people together. The corporate PACs want Republicans and Democrats in office, and they want them to work together to compromise to get things done. That's not what super PACs want. Super PACs in the system we have now are pulling people apart.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy to say maybe corporate PACs are the answer to fixing our politics, but it might be true.
Well, speaking of corporate PACs and super PACs, and we're running towards the end of time, and I appreciate your time with us, Brody. Let me just ask you a little bit about the ethics part of this. You've seen lobbying from the outside. David Rehr and I have seen it from the inside. What in your view here defines in today's rules and regulations ethical versus unethical lobbying? And then as part of that, what are your thoughts for our students that are thinking about this career path?
You're asking the difference between ethical and unethical lobbying?
Yes. How do you define today ethical and unethical lobbying? What do you see ethical and unethical lobbying today?
That's a hard question to answer. I think most people who are working as lobbyists, who are registering as a lobbyist and disclosing their activities, I mean, those are the rules of the game. I think the unethical lobbying is sort of the people who are doing things behind the scenes under the guise of working for someone else, or furtively or secretly. I think the idea should be that, again, the Constitution, our government says lobbying is perfectly fine. It's legal. You just have to disclose what you're doing so the American people can decide. And if you're avoiding that disclosure purposely, that undermines the whole system. So I would think that would be at the same time, I can call it unethical. At the same time, most of that lobbying is legal also. You're allowed to run polls and run issue ads and try to get constituents to support a policy or not. There's nothing wrong about that, but it just seems like there should be better disclosure.
Yeah. And I would
any
add,
advice?
David, if I can,
Yes, please.
there should be more transparency too.
Of course.
And we should do it sooner rather than later. You shouldn't have to wait. I think the FEC, and you may know this better than me, Brody, it takes like a year to make sure all the filings are done for all the contributions, even though they say you have to file every month because the technology is bad. But if they had when you made your report, it was available the next day and open to the public, your opponent's campaign and the media might have more availability to get the word out on who's really giving you money and what they really believe.
Which I think is what they basically do in Virginia, right? In Virginia, there's no caps. Companies are allowed to give directly to candidates.
Yeah.
They just have to disclose it. And that seems like a better system than we have right now.
Correct. We can give unlimited amount of money by individuals or by companies to anybody running for state elections, not for congressional elections or federal elections in Virginia. You just have to disclose it. Any thoughts for our students that are thinking of becoming lobbyists?
Yeah, I mean, lobbying is a constitutionally protected career. I think it's a career where in Washington, more and more people are joining. I think it's an exciting place. Like other jobs in DC, the lobbying world really rewards people who are smart and motivated and go-getters. And anyone can become a lobbyist, can represent clients, can be successful and make a lot of money. There's not a whole system of rules and regulations for how you get into lobbying. So, just like journalism or working on Capitol Hill or working at a think tank, I think the lobbying world rewards smart young people who are aggressive and want to out hustle the next guy.
And I'll tell you, they're important for the system as much as lobbyists get a bad rep, and as much as we talk about corruption, influence, and all of that. They are absolutely subject matter experts in general and carry a lot of institutional knowledge. When I got elected for office in Virginia, I would tell people all the time, I know three things in life. I know education, I know business, and I know politics. If you come and talk to me about agriculture, I'm going to need to cast a vote in agriculture. I don't know it, so I would depend on the lobbyists from both sides of that issue to not only pitch their position on the issue, but also to educate me on that particular subject matter. So they are important, and they do a good service. Final thoughts from you, Brody, and from my co-host, Dr. David Rehr, before I close it out.
Well, let me just jump in and say, as a lobbyist and now as a faculty member, Brody, you were supposed to say, to be a good lobbyist, you should take David Rehr's class. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to promote myself. But it is amazing the nonprofit world and all the different advocacy groups that are out there, where if you're involved, you care about healthcare and cancer, and you're involved in a group that's fighting cancer, and you win. And you then meet people who benefited, their lives benefited, their families benefit because you won and you got a law or regulation passed or changed. It is phenomenally rewarding for you as an individual. And as I said before, I talked to my class a lot about my experiences, but I remember early on in the lobbying career when Dan Rostenkowski was still the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee many, many years ago, and they had a healthcare bill that would have hurt small businesses providing healthcare to their workers. And we won, despite the fact that all of Washington said we would never win. And, we got some heavy-handed things thrown at us at the NFIB many, many years ago. That was one of my personally most rewarding moments because I saved people hundreds of thousands of dollars and made lives better. And now I'll give it back to you to finish up with a bigger story.
Brody?
The thing I find fascinating again is that history is repeating itself, which it has before. We had this era where with the industrial titans and monopolists of the Standard Oils and the robber barons and the JP Morgans, and we followed that up with the progressive era, and where the American people elected officials to Congress who reined in big companies and created the antitrust laws and the FTC. And from that period, from the New Deal to Great Society, we had the flip side where consumer groups had all this influence and companies didn't. And then in the 1970s, we switched and had companies have power. And it seems like we might be coming to another pivot point where increasingly Republicans and Democrats are getting together and saying these big companies have too much power and too much influence and need to be reined in. We see that at some of these antitrust cases with Google and, the one on Facebook just lost, but there's others coming. And I wonder if we're at a pivot point where consumers are gaining influence at the expense of corporate America. And that'll be a fascinating thing to watch in the next, 10 or 15 years.
Indeed. Brody, thank you for this deep dive into how influence operates in our nation's capital, and for your fearless work keeping power accountable. David, always a pleasure co-hosting with you. Listeners, Brody Mullins' new book, The Wolves of K Street, is out, and I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to understand the political machine behind public policy. You can hear this and all of our episodes at char.gmu.edu/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. We are syndicated on all the major platforms. I am Dr. David Ramadan. Thanks for tuning in to Policy and Governance Perspectives. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives. We truly appreciate you joining us for these important discussions featuring voices from across the Schar School. For more information and to explore our archive of past episodes, please visit char.gmu.edu/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you next time.